and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Trigger warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of racial violence.
Hi, my name is Alexis Pearson, and I am a recent Master's of Public Policy graduate from the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Welcome to the Chicagoland Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking with Dr. Omar Wasow, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. We're going to be going over his most recent article, Agenda Seeding: How 1960s Black Protests Moved Elite Public Opinion and Voting. And we're also going to talk about the role of the 60s civil rights movement, the role of media and public perception of social uprisings, the definition of violence and how that impacts social opinion and public opinion, and the methods that can be used to actually make a substantial impact. The discussions and implications around Dr. Wasow's study apply nationwide, but we want to see them within a Chicago context. As a policy school located in the South Side of Chicago, it's important that we critically investigate the context in which we sit. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Wasow, for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start off this interview by simply just asking if you could give us a little background on who you are, what inspired you to do the work that you're doing, and how did you get into the lanes that you are in right now?
So I am, as you noted, an assistant professor at Princeton. I'm in the politics department, but my training is in a mix of political science, statistics, and my PhD is actually in African American studies. And what took me back to graduate school after having been an entrepreneur for many years was that there were these questions of trying to understand what went wrong after the victories of the mid-60s. And so went to graduate school, both to kind of acquire skills that were things like statistics, but also to get a deeper grounding in history and sociology and political science and things that might help explain the transition from the 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, to a period in the kind of 70s and later where we saw the rise of law and order politics, much more punitive criminal justice system, and in many ways a period of economic dislocation for a lot of poorer African Americans. So that was what took me back to graduate school. And over the course of my research, I really began to notice that there's this period in the sort of between the early 60s and the late 60s where the public concern shifted from concerns about civil rights to concerns around law and order. And I was trying to understand what contributed to that transition. And as I began to dig deeper, found that protest movements were playing a really powerful role in influencing public opinion.
So your article is actually really insightful in looking at the ways in which protests, like you just said, influence the ways in which people respond to whatever the protesters are protesting about. So can you give us like a little bit more detail about that particular article that you guys wrote?
Sure. So I was particularly interested in trying to understand the rise of law and order politics. And what was striking when I looked at data was that there's this period in the early 1960s where when people are asked, and to be clear, America's 90% white at that time. So when we're talking about, a public opinion survey, you're basically talking about white public opinion. And so when surveys asked, what's the most important problem in America, in the early part of the 60s, there were a couple of spikes where civil rights becomes the most important problem in America.
And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops.
And what was interesting to me was that spike in public opinion followed massive protest actions on the ground led by civil rights leaders. So when there's the March on Washington, in months, the percentage of people saying civil rights is the most important problem in America spikes massively. And within a year, we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In 1965, following the Bloody Sunday marches in Selma, there's another big spike in public concern about civil rights. And within 5 months, the Voting Rights Act is passed. And so in the early part of the 1960s, there was this pattern of direct action, often direct action met by violence by the state, right? So in something like Selma, there's all of this vigilante and state violence against peaceful protesters. And the images of that, particularly transmitted through the media, appear to have formed public opinion in favor of the civil rights movement. In the later part of the 1960s, protesters begin to engage in more direct action that includes violent resistance to state oppression. And what that means in practice is that there are protests on the ground where there are acts of arson, or there's more direct action that involves, in some cases, things like attacks on police. And we see more injury, death, property damage of a significant nature. And when those events are covered by the media, the headlines are no longer about civil rights, they're about crime and riots. And so the core of the story is that protests on the ground influence media, and media influences public opinion. And so we see in the later part of the 1960s is as these protests include more aggressive resistance to white supremacy, we also see the media, the mainstream media, devote a lot more attention to concerns about disorder, crime, riots, and public opinion. When people are asked what's the most important problem in America, they start talking about things like law and order, social control, crime, and riots. And what I find in my paper is that shift in public opinion is enough to have likely moved the 1968 election from the candidate who was on the Democratic side, lead author of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, to Nixon, who was campaigning on law and order for more, tough on crime, more punitive criminal justice policy.
So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence.
Analysis of looking at media was very crucial in actually understanding the ways in which public opinion were focused, but then it made me think about the ways in which media has changed since the 60s until now. And so I want to know your opinion about how, since we do have these new forms of media, including specifically social media, and how information is being disseminated in a wide variety of ways, all of them not being credible, all of them not being media outlets, but rather just everyday people. How do you think that source of information being spread and those forms of media are influencing public opinion?
It's a great question, and I think it's important to kind of emphasize maybe one of several different things that are happening with the media. So the first part of it is that clearly not all protests work through media. So there are some protests that are boycotts, right? So the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 goes for 381 days, people walking miles to break the back of segregation on buses, right? And that's less of a campaign that works through the media than one that puts pressure on local officials and local businesses. So that's one way protests can work, and that can still work now, whether or not it gets covered in media. In the 1960s, what strategic civil rights leaders figured out was that if they could get attention, then that might help move the kind of national conversation. And it's important to realize that in the 1960s, that the Southern media was pro-segregation on the whole, and the media outside the South was pretty much content to tolerate Jim Crow. So the only media that was really paying attention to Black concerns about discrimination, about Black life in general, was the Black press. And so what the civil rights leaders figured out was that if they engaged in direct action and civil disobedience, where the state engaged in repression, that would attract media attention, because the media really like drama and conflict. And then those images would have a powerful effect on the kind of national concern about civil rights. And that worked in a couple of different ways. So one is, not every protest had to be one where, someone like Bull Connor was engaging in violent repression, but a peaceful protest on its own could often seem to folks outside of the South as like a kind of normal politics where things are working as they're supposed to. And if you kind of see an image of a peaceful protest and everything looks like it's, a conventional kind of assembly under the First Amendment redress of grievances, then you might say, well, there's no need to intervene. There's no need to escalate the kind of national response around fighting segregation. But when they could engage in protests where the state would engage in repression, those images were very powerful at making the rest of the country to realize, in the words of the 60s, it would shock the conscience of the nation. And if they could shock the conscience of the nation, that would mobilize people outside of the South to want to make change on segregation. And so coming back to your question about media, I think part of what was powerful in the 60s is still at work today. So images of, state violence do a lot of work to change the way people think about things like police reform. And so an image like a 75-year-old man being knocked over in Buffalo and, having his head, watching him bleed out of his ears, and then police just stroll by, that does a lot of work in the same way that seeing an image, a young man being attacked by a dog, or young people being hit with fire hoses. So I think there's some core dynamics that work across the technologies across time, because humans at some core level have a capacity for empathy. And even if I've never been to Buffalo and don't feel any particular connection to that person, I can be horrified by how he was treated. And that, I think, is some of the same dynamic that was playing out in the 60s. Now, what is different is that media is much more fragmented now.
Violence. That's where we saw people throwing rocks at police cars, at the precinct building, people spray painting police cars.
What I want to make sure is not lost in this, as we're seeing these remarkable pictures with this law enforcement presence directly behind you, is the why. Why people have been out on the streets protesting. Why this violence is taking place.
And that's going to mean that people are exposed to different narratives and maybe not seeing more of the kinds of video clips that are quite shocking, again, of police violence. But I think, again, kind of echo of the past, which I think means that in some ways the same dynamics very much may still be at play, is that I think one of the main stories that's come out of the last few weeks in protests against police violence has been the astonishing level of violence by the state against peaceful protesters. And there's just been all of this footage documented by people with their cell phone cameras in particular that has allowed folks not at a protest to have some window into how the police, there's a claim by protesters that the police are out of control. And then here are images and video of police behaving in a way that seems out of control. And that, I think, does a lot of work to support the case of the protest movement, much as in the early 1960s, the images that came out of something like Bloody Sunday did a lot of work to move national opinion on the urgency of civil rights.
I really want us to unpack this word of violence, like this definition of violence, because I think that violence today and then it takes a lot of different forms depending on who's talking about it and the ways in which we are analyzing it, right? So specifically, the threat of violence is also something that has been very present recently following all of these uprisings and protests that have been happening in response to the murder of George Floyd. And so I wanted for us to unpack that definition a little bit more, to talk about how exactly are we defining violence, especially when it comes to separating it from protesters' nonviolence and state nonviolence and protesters' violence and state violence. So what does that mean exactly?
Defining violence either by protesters or the state is hard, but it's something that sociologists have been doing for 50 years to try and really understand how different kinds of tactics, either by protesters or by the state, influences outcomes. And so I build on that work. And just very quickly, in one of the data sets I use that looks at protester-initiated violence, it needs to be at least 30 people. It needs to include significant injury, property damage, or death. It needs to occur in a protest that's off of an institutional setting, so not on a college campus, for example. And that kind of analysis then, and in this case, I'm looking at ones that are focused on civil rights. So these are Black-led events. In the case of police violence, there's a continuum that goes from sort of routine policing up to things like the use of tear gas. And there's a continuum there that's coded. And so I use those different criteria to be able to say, well, this is an event that included significant police violence, or this is an event that included significant protester violence. And that's kind of the core of the analysis. And then I think there are other sort of more subtle questions that people pose around things like, well, is property damage violence? And in the case of what the sociologists have been using for the last 50 years, property damage is considered violence. And so